There's this feeling, isn't there? Like, even though we're told after 2008 that things were fixed, stable again, a lot of people still feel, I don't know, uneasy about the economy. Like something's just fundamentally off.
Yeah, that disconnect is really there between the official story and how people actually feel day to day. That anxiety, it didn't just vanish for everyone.
Exactly. So we dove into some material that offers a pretty stark explanation for that feeling. It's from a documentary transcript, The Global Economy is a Pyramid Scheme, End of the Road. And its whole point is that maybe 2008 wasn't the real problem. Maybe it was just a symptom.
Right, a symptom of something deeper, more structural. This view really questions the foundations of, our whole financial system today, especially since a particular point just over 50 years ago.
And the core claim, it's pretty provocative.
Yeah.
The global economy, particularly the U.S. system, has basically been running like a Ponzi scheme since the early 70s.
Fueled by more and more debt. Yeah. And the argument is this structure has real, measurable effects on everyday life. Inflation, living standards, and it could lead to some, serious instability down the line.
Okay, let's unpack that. We need to walk through the history this source presents, that break from gold it talks about.
Yeah.
How this debt-fueled system supposedly works, the consequences for, regular people, and what the documentary sees as potential futures or actions.
It's definitely a perspective that makes you question some things you might take for granted about money.
So the story, according to the source, kicks off right after World War II. The Allies meet in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 1944. The mission: build a stable financial system from the wreckage.
And the U.S. was, clearly the dominant economic power then. So the system they set up made the U.S. dollar the world's reserve currency.
And the big reason for that, the dollar was seen as good as gold.
Exactly. That was the key. The mechanism was other countries fixed their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar itself pegged the gold, $35 an ounce, fixed.
So holding dollars was basically like holding gold, indirectly. Countries could swap their currency for dollars and then, crucially, swap those dollars for actual U.S. gold if they wanted. Gave the whole system an anchor, right? Stability.
Yeah, it imposed a kind of discipline, on government spending, theoretically.
Yeah.
Designed to stop countries just devaluing their money whenever they felt like it, like before the war.
But, that anchor didn't hold forever. The source points to August 15th, 1971 as like the moment. What happened?
Well, the source says it was driven by rising U.S. government spending in the 60s and early 70s. The Great Society programs, the Vietnam War. The U.S. started running big budget deficits.
Which meant more dollars flooding the world. And other countries started getting nervous.
Yeah, they started wondering, does the U.S. actually have enough gold to back all these dollars at $35 an ounce? That was the promise. And that worry grew. Countries like France, they actually started showing up and saying, okay, give us the gold for these dollars. That put real pressure on U.S. gold reserves.
And that led to President Nixon's announcement, August 15th, 1971. He temporarily suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold. And the source really highlights that temporary part because, well, here we are 50 plus years later.
Exactly. And what the source argues is this move basically cut the cord. It removed that discipline mechanism. Before, if a country ran huge deficits, gold would flow out, signaling a problem. You had to fix it.
But without that link,
governments, especially the U.S., could run, the source calls them perpetual deficits. It notes the U.S. hasn't had a budget surplus since 1971. The tie to gold was gone. Currencies were now backed by, the source says nothing.
Which brings us to this idea of fiat currency.
Yes, and the source defines it pretty bluntly. Money backed not by a physical thing like gold, but just by government decree. Government says it's money. It circulates, as they put it, by force, because the law says you have to accept it for debts.
And the core problem with that, according to this view,
it's that a government can just declare something with no real value paper or an electronic blip to be money and force everyone to use it.
So without gold as the measuring stick, how do you even value these currencies?
Mostly just against each other, which, the source says, leads to this game of competitive devaluation. Countries try to make their currency cheaper to boost exports. The dollar is still hugely important as the reserve currency, obviously, but its value isn't tied down by gold anymore.
Okay, so we have this system. Currency by decree, perpetual deficits. How does the source make the leap to calling it a Ponzi scheme?
It draws a direct parallel. It defines a Ponzi scheme in the classic way. Uses money from new investors to pay off earlier investors. Needs constant growth to survive. Doesn't actually generate value, just shuffles money around.
And the claim is the U.S. financial system works like that. That's bold.
It is, but here's the mechanism the source describes. The U.S. government needs money it doesn't have from taxes. It borrows it. Often it says from the Federal Reserve, the central bank.
Okay, where does the Fed get the money to lend?
The source claims the Fed essentially creates it out of nothing, just digitally, like typing numbers into a computer. In exchange for this new money, the government gives the Fed IOUs government bonds.
Right, so the government gets cash, issues debt.
Exactly. Then the government spends that borrowed money. And those government bonds, they get sold off to others, foreign governments, pension funds, individuals, you name it. For a long time, U.S. bonds were seen as like the safest investment on earth, risk-free.
But wait, here's the crucial part the source focuses on. Where does the money come from to pay back that original loan from the Fed, plus all the interest on all the bonds out there?
And this is the core of the Ponzi argument. According to this source, that money comes from borrowing even more money by issuing new bonds.
Ah, so you're not paying debt down, you're just rolling it over into bigger debts.
Precisely. The source argues this is the dynamic. The system depends on finding more and more new lenders, larger and larger groups of investors, just to meet the payments on the old debt. The total debt itself, in this view, can never actually be paid off. It just requires more and more new debt creation to keep going.
And if that borrowing, that money creation, slows down or stops?
The source is blunt. The
Yeah.
whole thing would crash, because the money to pay old debts and interest literally comes from creating new debt. If that stops, the payments stop. That's the fundamental instability it points to.
Okay, if that's the supposed engine, what does it mean for, the average person? The source hits hard on inflation.
Oh, absolutely. A primary consequence, according to this view, is that creating money from nothing dilutes the value of all the money already out there, your savings, your paycheck. They buy less over time. That's inflation.
We definitely see prices go up. Milk, gas.
Exactly. The source uses those examples: milk, eggs, meat costing more, gas prices compared to decades ago. And it argues this isn't just annoying, it directly erodes living standards because incomes don't keep up with these rising costs.
And the source suggests this forced major shifts in how people live over the decades.
Yeah, it traces this kind of progression, like starting in the 70s, often needing two incomes for what one used to cover. Then in the 90s, savings rates basically went to zero. People couldn't afford to save anymore if they wanted to maintain their spending. And then more recently, even two incomes and no savings wasn't enough. So people started borrowing heavily, well beyond their means, just to get by. Credit cards, mortgages.
And the source calls inflation a hidden tax.
That's the term they use, because by devaluing the currency, the government effectively takes purchasing power away from you without passing a specific tax law. The source is really critical of central banks targeting, say, 2% inflation. They call it robbery because it guarantees your money loses value steadily over time.
It even claims the official numbers, like the CPI inflation measure, are misleading.
Yeah, it argues the government uses contrivances, changes in how they calculate it, to make inflation look lower than it really is for ordinary people. It suggests if you use the same calculation method as the late 70s, inflation today would look much higher, maybe like 9 or 10%.
And why would they allegedly do that?
The source suggests it helps the government financially. Lower official inflation means smaller cost of living adjustments for things like Social Security payments. But it goes beyond just your wallet. The source links this system to bigger societal changes too.
Like losing industries.
Right. Remember that competitive devaluation idea. If countries can cheapen their currency, it makes their products cheaper overseas. That makes it tough for industries in countries with stronger currencies, like the U.S. historically, to compete. The source uses this to explain why manufacturing jobs moved overseas, mentioning places like Toledo and Akron losing their industrial base.
Which naturally fuels frustration.
Absolutely. People see jobs go, they struggle with student debt, costs go up, but the official inflation number seems low, and then they see things like Wall Street bailouts and big bonuses. The source connects all that frustration back to this underlying monetary system.
It even touches on protests, like Occupy Wall Street.
It does. It acknowledges the frustration is real and understandable, but it points out what it sees as a kind of paradox. Often, the protesters demand more government spending, more programs, which, in the source's view, means demanding more of the very thing debt-fueled spending that it claims caused the problem in the first place. It's just observing that dynamic.
And this whole situation, the source views it as maybe the end game.
That's the feeling it conveys. Like this 40-plus year experiment with global fiat currency, starting in '71, is maybe reaching its limit. It talks about deleveraging, people being totally maxed out on debt.
What about the 2008 crisis then? Wasn't that the system almost breaking?
According to this perspective, yes. It was right on the edge of that inevitable collapse. But instead of letting it happen, the source says governments and central banks just papered over the cracks. Massive bailouts, guarantees, printing huge amounts of money. They didn't fix the underlying bad debts or failing institutions.
So just delayed the problem.
Delayed it and made it bigger. That's the argument. The source uses the phrase, kicking the can down the road. But it suggests the can got enormous and maybe we've run out of road.
Which logically leads to the fear of a currency crisis or even hyperinflation.
Right. If the solution keeps being print more money, the source warns that risks a really sharp drop in the dollar's value, like maybe 20, 30, 40% potentially very quickly. That could cause a worldwide loss of confidence. What happens when the world's safe currency suddenly seems risky?
What could set that off?
The source says it could be anything, really. A natural disaster, some political shock, or just sentiment finally turning. Or something specific, like a U.S. Treasury auction, failing not enough buyers for the debt, which would force interest rates way up.
And if the buyers walk away, if people wake up to the con, as the source puts it.
That's when it argues the whole thing implodes. If the world market stops buying U.S. debt, the only buyer left might be the Fed itself, printing money to buy its own government's bonds.
And that's the real endgame signal.
According to this view, yes. That's either the final meltdown or the direct on-ramp to hyperinflation.
Remind us what hyperinflation really means.
It's when inflation goes totally out of control, prices rise so fast people lose all faith in the money. The source describes a flight from the currency. Everyone tries to spend their cash instantly on anything real because tomorrow, maybe even later today, it'll be worth much less. Think Weimar Germany, money becoming worthless, used as wallpaper. That's a historical nightmare scenario.
What would that feel like, day to day?
Just constant scrambling. The source paints a picture. Needing to buy 2 cans of tuna now because the price will jump by evening. Immense economic hardship. Retirees may be forced back to work, property decaying because people can only afford essentials. The whole economy is seizing up.
And because the dollar is the global reserve currency.
A dollar hyperinflation would be globally catastrophic, the source warns. So many other countries hold dollars, peg their currencies to it. A collapse would likely drag most other currencies down too. It's uncharted territory for the world's main reserve currency. But the source points out that historically, currency collapses always come down to bad policies, bad management. And it argues the dollar is heading towards the fiat currency graveyard.
Okay, that's a really alarming perspective. If the system is viewed as this fragile, why not just go back to gold? What's stopping that?
Well, the source has a clear answer. The people benefiting from the current system, the people at the top, they don't want it to end.
And it alleges they actively work to keep gold prices down.
That's a major claim as the source material, yeah. That gold and silver prices are artificially suppressed. Why? To make the dollar and other paper assets look better, stronger. Gold is seen as the dollar's main competitor. It's described as a check on government power, a government's chaperone. An enemy of big government, but a friend of freedom. The powers that be, Wall Street, governments, they prefer dealing in paper they can control.
How do they supposedly do this suppression?
The source lists a few methods. One is central banks selling off their gold reserves. It mentions the Bank of England selling a lot of its gold very cheaply in the late 90s, early 2000s. The source calls that the dumbest decision and suggests it was part of a coordinated effort by some Western central banks to dump gold onto the market and keep prices low. Another technique mentioned is gold leasing. Central banks lending out their gold reserves to big commercial banks, bullion banks. That leased gold then enters the market supply, pushing prices down. The source even cites old Alan Greenspan testimony hinting they'd lease gold if prices got too high.
Lending to bullion banks. How does that work?
The idea is central banks lend physical gold to these big banks. The banks sell the gold, depressing the price. Then maybe they use the cash raised to buy government bonds. It's presented as this kind of circular system that supports government debt and suppresses gold. And there's also a claim about dodgy accounting practices at some big Western central banks like the New York Fed, Bank of England.
Dodgy how?
The allegation is they might report gold they physically have and gold they've loaned out as if it's all one and the same, securely in their vaults. This could mean there are multiple claims on the same ounce of physical gold. The source uses the line, if you can't hold it, you don't own it. It suggests this could be a huge hidden problem, maybe even fraudulent.
Are people tracking this?
Yes, the source mentions groups like GATA, the Gold Antitrust Action Committee. They gather evidence they say points strongly towards manipulation, comparing it to building a case in a murder trial.
Hmm. But even with this alleged suppression, the source says things are changing, cracks appearing.
It does. It points out that demand for physical gold and silver is supposedly skyrocketing. People getting nervous,
Yeah.
wanting something tangible.
And it's not just individuals buying.
Right. A key point made is that central banks outside that traditional Western group, China, Russia, India, Mexico are named, have been buying hundreds and hundreds of tons of physical gold. That's seen as a major shift, maybe moving away from holding only dollars.
Which leads to a potential bombshell scenario. If these banks, or anyone, demands physical delivery of gold that isn't actually there.
Exactly. If it turns out Western central banks have leased out or oversold way more gold than they physically possess, the source suggests that could expose the biggest scam ever perpetrated.
A global financial scandal.
Potentially massive, yeah. Bigger than Madoff, bigger than anything we've seen, if those claims about gold accounting and leasing turn out to be true on a large scale.
This all sounds incredibly bleak, but the source doesn't just leave it there, right? It talks about what individuals can do.
It does offer a path. It argues politicians and central bankers are basically stuck. Their main tool, maybe their only tool, is creating more money inflation. They won't stop, the source claims, because stopping would crash the system they manage and, frankly, put them all out of business. So the solution offered isn't to rely on them.
It's like, if the government won't put the country back on a gold standard, maybe you can put yourself on one.
That's pretty much the core advice for individuals. Buy physical gold and silver. Hold it yourself. The source emphasizes it has real intrinsic value, it's genuinely scarce, unlike paper money, and it holds its purchasing power over centuries. That old saying, an ounce of gold today buys the same thing it bought 2,000 years ago.
So it's like buying financial insurance.
That's exactly how it's framed. Something tangible outside the digital or paper system to protect your wealth if things get really unstable. The argument is nothing else provides that kind of hedge against a fiat currency crisis.
But it's not just about hunkering down. There's opportunity, too.
Yes. Interestingly, the source doesn't paint the potential collapse as pure doom. It suggests that chaos could be a reset. A move away from propping up what it calls the U.S. Ponzi scheme could actually lead to great prosperity elsewhere, and maybe the greatest wealth transfer in history for people who see it coming and prepare.
In this environment, it argues tangible money. Gold and silver is the best investment, much better than assets that lose value to inflation.
And the absolute #1 thing to do.
Financial education. Over and over, the source stresses. Don't just trust the usual sources, banks, brokers. You need to find out what's going on for yourself. Empower yourself with knowledge.
Wow. Okay, so quite a journey through this source material, a really challenging perspective, arguing the whole global system since '71 is like a giant debt Ponzi scheme born from breaking the link to gold. We've touched on the history, the mechanics described, the impact on daily life through inflation, the claims about gold suppression, and the stark warnings about a potential crisis.
And also the proposed individual response. Getting educated and considering tangible assets like gold and silver as a shield, maybe even an opportunity.
The source leaves us with this thought. Maybe 2008 wasn't the end, but a pause. Time bought, perhaps for those benefiting from the system, but also maybe time for you, the listener, to understand these arguments and think about how you want to navigate whatever comes next.
Yeah, it really pushes you to consider if there's even a chance the conventional system has these deep structural issues the source describes, how much should you rely on your own research and understanding versus just following standard financial advice, and what practical steps might flow from that?
Definitely gives you a lot to think about. Challenges the way many of us were taught to see money and the economy. Understanding these different views, though, especially the controversial ones, that's what these deep dives are for.